Imagine the crack of a musket echoing through Jamaica's dark mountain passes. A group of British soldiers advances cautiously, torches in hand, their red coats glinting faintly in the moonlight. Suddenly, silence. Then a sharp whistle cuts through the night. From the shadows, arrows hiss, stones tumble, and unseen warriors strike with deadly precision. By dawn, the soldiers lie defeated, their bodies scattered along the forest floor. And at the heart of this haunting war stands a woman the enslaved whispered about with reverence. And the British feared like a phantom. Her name was Nanny of the Maroons. The stage, Jamaica, the 18th century. To understand Nanny's legend, we must first descend into the brutal world of 18th century Jamaica. By the early 1700s, Jamaica had become the crown jewel of Britain's Caribbean empire, not because of gold, but because of sugar. The sugar plantations stretched for miles, their wealth built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Plantation life was hell. Enslaved men and women toiled under a scorching sun, their bodies whipped raw, their souls crushed by endless labor. At night, the cries of the lash echoed across the fields, mingling with the groans of the dying. Disease, malnutrition, and punishment killed thousands. And yet Britain's thirst for sugar, white gold, never slowed. But in the shadows of Jamaica's lush blue mountains, a different story was unfolding. There lived men and women who had escaped these plantations. They called themselves the Maroons, a name taken from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild or untamed. These communities, forged by fugitives, became strongholds of freedom. They built hidden villages, survived off the land, and struck back against their oppressors. And among them rose one of the fiercest leaders in history, Nanny, whispers of a woman warrior. No one can say with certainty when Nanny was born. Some say she came from the Ashanti people of West Africa, captured and dragged across the Atlantic on a slave ship. Others believe she was born in Jamaica itself, a child of the first Maroons. But one truth remained constant in every version. Nanny was no ordinary woman. The legends say she had fiery eyes that could unsettle even the bravest soldier. Some swore she could catch bullets with her bare hands. Others whispered she wielded the power of Obeah, a spiritual force rooted in African tradition that gave her supernatural protection. Yet beyond the myths, Nanny's strength lay in her mind. She was a tactician, a leader, and above all, a mother to her people. The birth of a leader. As the plantation chains tightened across Jamaica, Nanny began to rise as a guiding light among the Maroons. She gathered runaway slaves, offering them shelter in her mountain stronghold. She taught them to fight not like the British, but like hunters, using the land itself as their weapon. The Blue Mountains were treacherous terrain, steep cliffs, thick forests, and hidden caves. For the British, it was a nightmare to navigate. But for Nanny and her warriors, it was home. They dug camouflaged pits, used horns to signal ambushes, and vanished into the trees like smoke. Nanny knew something the British could never accept. The people fighting for freedom will always fight harder than men fighting for empire. War of Fire and Shadows. By the early 1720s, the Maroons were no longer just fugitives hiding in the hills. They had become a thorn in Britain's side. Plantation owners complained of constant raids, slaves disappearing in the night, stores of weapons stolen, crops set ablaze. At the heart of these raids was Nanny. She led small bands of warriors down from the mountains to strike plantations with ruthless precision. They killed overseers, freed captives, and melted back into the forest before soldiers could arrive. Each successful raid fed the legend of the woman leader who defied an empire. British authorities branded her a terrorist, but for the enslaved, she was a savior. The more the British tried to crush the Maroons, the stronger Nanny's name grew. Fear in the colonial capital, in the capital of Spanish Town, officials debated how to end the Maroon threat. Reports came in of soldiers vanishing without a trace in the mountains. Some described finding bodies pierced by arrows, others mutilated in ways too gruesome to repeat. Plantation owners whispered that their hunters had become the hunted. "This Nanny woman," one governor is said to have remarked, "is worth more than 10 regiments against us." The British sent patrols into the mountains, but few returned. The deeper they marched, the more it felt like the land itself conspired against them. The legend grows around campfires in hidden Maroon villages. Children listened wide-eyed as elders told stories of Nanny. They said she could appear and vanish at will, that her whistle could summon warriors from miles away. Whether myth or truth, one fact remained. She was always there, guiding her people, protecting their freedom, and hunting the slave masters who dared invade her mountains. And as the 18th century wore on, her legend would only grow stronger, until the British would be forced to face her directly in a war that would shake Jamaica to its core. In the next part, we will journey deeper into the mountains to see how Nanny transformed her hidden village into an impenetrable fortress, and how the British Empire prepared for a brutal campaign to bring her down. High in the mists of Jamaica's Blue Mountains, smoke curls from hidden fires. A village lies concealed beneath towering trees, invisible to any stranger's eye. Here men sharpen spears, women grind cassava into flour, and children laugh freely. No chains, no whips, no overseers. At the center stands a figure draped in cloth, her gaze fierce yet nurturing. This is not just a village. It is a kingdom of freedom, and its queen is Nanny of the Maroons. The hidden stronghold Nanny knew that survival depended on more than raids. To truly resist, her people needed a sanctuary, a place where the British could never reach them. She chose a spot deep in the Blue Mountains, surrounded by cliffs and thick jungle. It was called Nanny Town. The settlement was a masterpiece of strategy. Narrow paths wound upward, easily defended by a handful of warriors. Caves dotted the hillsides, serving as hiding places and storage. At night, fires were hidden, smoke funneled carefully so it would vanish into the mist. For the enslaved Africans who found their way here, Nanny Town was a miracle. One moment they were fugitives, hunted like animals. The next, they stood in a free community where no whip cracked and no master's voice barked orders. Life among the Maroons. Nanny's people built homes of wood and palm leaves, planted yams, bananas, and cassava in hidden plots. They raised goats and pigs, hunted wild game, and fished in mountain streams. Music, drumming, and storytelling filled the nights, preserving the rhythms and legends of Africa. Freedom was more than survival. It was culture, memory, and identity. In Nanny Town, children grew up knowing songs of warriors instead of the chains of slavery. Women played crucial roles as farmers, fighters, and healers. Elders kept alive the memory of their stolen homeland, telling tales of the Ashanti and Akan, so the people would never forget who they were. At the heart of it all was Nanny, not as a distant ruler, but as a mother figure. She settled disputes, performed rituals, trained warriors, and watched over the community like a hawk. The war council inside her stronghold, Nanny often held councils of war. Warriors sat in circles, their faces lit by firelight, listening to her voice. She spoke of strategy, of patience, of striking only when the moment was right. The British had muskets and cannons, but the Maroons had the land. Nanny drilled her fighters in guerrilla tactics. They learned to vanish into the forest, to mimic the calls of birds as signals, to use silence as a weapon. "The mountains are our fortress," she told them. "The forest is our shield, and freedom is our cause." First blood, the British could not ignore Nanny's growing power. By the 1720s, raids from her warriors had become relentless. Plantations burned, slaves disappeared, and British soldiers sent into the hills rarely returned. Determined to crush the rebellion, the colonial government dispatched patrols into the Blue Mountains. Dozens of redcoats marched upward, their muskets gleaming, but they walked into a nightmare. As they climbed, hidden horns sounded. Warriors emerged from the trees, releasing volleys of arrows and musket fire. Stones rolled down slopes, knocking soldiers from their feet. The forest seemed alive with enemies. By nightfall, the patrol was annihilated. Survivors fled, leaving behind weapons and supplies that the Maroons eagerly collected. Word spread quickly. The British Army had been humbled by a woman general in the mountains. The terror of ambushes over time. Nanny perfected her ambushes. The British marched in columns, rigid, disciplined, predictable. But Nanny's warriors moved like smoke. They struck from behind rocks, from treetops, from gullies. Then they vanished. Legends grew of the terrifying Abeng horn, a cow horn that Maroons used to communicate. A single blast could summon fighters miles away. British patrols claimed they heard its eerie cry echoing in the dark, moments before arrows rained down. Fear began to spread. Redcoats muttered about Nanny as if she were a spirit, an enemy who struck without warning and melted into the earth. Obeah and the power of belief. What made Nanny truly formidable was not just strategy, but belief. Many Maroons believed she wielded Obeah magic, inherited from African ancestors. Some said she could summon ancestral spirits to shield her people. The most famous legend told that Nanny could catch bullets with her hands, or even her buttocks, and send them back at the enemy. Whether true or not, the British soldiers believed it, and their fear of her became as powerful as her arrows. But Obeah was more than myth. It was a way of binding her community together, of giving them spiritual courage against an empire. In a world where the enemy seemed invincible, faith made them unbreakable. The British response, by the mid-1720s, the colonial governors were desperate. They sent larger forces into the mountains, even offering bounties for Nanny's capture. One official wrote bitterly, "This woman called Nanny has proved more troublesome than 100 men. She is a general in all but name." But the harder they pressed, the more cunning she became. Soldiers who tried to storm Nanny Town found themselves repelled again and again. Some claimed they saw her silhouette in the mist, standing atop a ridge, watching calmly as their columns fell apart. Nanny's philosophy, in rare moments of peace. Nanny spoke to her people not just as a commander, but as a philosopher. "We fight not for land nor for gold," she told them, "but for breath. The breath of our children, the breath of freedom. The British may own their plantations, but they will never own our mountains." These words became a kind of oath, whispered by warriors before battle. Foreshadowing the storm by the late 1720s, the conflict was escalating. The British were humiliated but determined. Nanny had turned her hidden village into a fortress of freedom, and every raid proved her strength. But deep in Spanish Town, governors plotted. They would not allow a community of free Africans to exist in the heart of their empire. Plans were being drawn for a campaign more ruthless than anything Nanny had yet faced. And soon, the Blue Mountains would run with blood. The jungle is quiet. Too quiet. A British patrol pushes forward, muskets ready, boots sinking into damp soil. The officer shouts for silence, but it is too late. Shrill horn echoes, the dreaded abeng. Suddenly, arrows, stones, and musket fire tear through the ranks. Screams pierce the night. By dawn, the jungle reclaims the bodies. And high on the ridge, a lone figure watches. The woman the British fear more than any man, Nanny of the Maroons. The British counterattack by the early 1730s. Nanny's success had become unbearable for the colonial government. Plantations continued to burn, and enslaved people slipped into the forests to join her cause. In desperation, the British prepared a large-scale military campaign. Dozens of redcoats marched with trackers, dogs, and supplies. Their orders: march into the Blue Mountains, find Nanny Town, and burn it to the ground. But the British underestimated the land and its defenders. The first campaign fails. The column advanced, heavy with supplies, sweating under the tropical heat. But the mountains seemed alive with eyes. Nanny's scouts watched every movement, tracking the patrols silently. When the moment came, the Maroons struck like lightning. They attacked supply wagons, cutting off food and water. They ambushed from above, dropping rocks and unleashing arrows. Soldiers slipped into hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes. The British fought back with musket volleys, but the dense forest turned their formations into chaos. Smoke blinded them, echoes confused them, and unseen warriors struck with deadly precision. After weeks of frustration, the campaign collapsed. Dozens of soldiers were dead. Survivors staggered back down the mountains, haunted by the name Nanny. The Phantom of the Mountains. It was during these years that Nanny's legend grew to supernatural heights. Survivors swore she appeared and vanished like a ghost. Some claimed they saw her catch musket balls in her hands. Others swore she used herbs and spells to make her warriors invisible. Fear is a powerful weapon, and Nanny wielded it better than any musket. The siege of Nanny Town humiliated. The British regrouped. The new governor authorized another massive assault. This time they would not only march, they would attempt to siege Nanny Town. Hundreds of redcoats scaled the mountain slopes, cutting paths through the forest. They brought cannons, determined to blast the stronghold apart. But Nanny had prepared. Her warriors struck in waves, never letting the soldiers rest. By day, arrows and musket fire harassed their lines. By night, sudden raids stole supplies and left sentries dead. When the British finally reached Nanny Town, they found a village fortified with traps, trenches, and warriors ready to die before surrendering. The cannons roared, shattering huts and trees. Smoke and screams filled the air. For days, the battle raged. The British claimed victory when they finally overran the village, but it was a hollow triumph, for Nanny had vanished into the jungle with her people, the spirit of resistance, even in defeat. Nanny proved indestructible. British officers wrote in frustration that the woman Nanny could never be captured. Each time they thought her finished, she returned, leading raids, striking terror, keeping the rebellion alive. To the enslaved across Jamaica, this was hope. Stories spread that no matter how many soldiers came, the woman warrior still lived, still fought, still protected freedom in the mountains. Nanny's tactics. What made Nanny so successful was not brute force. It was guerrilla mastery. Ambushes. She studied British movements, striking only when her enemies were most vulnerable. Deception. Warriors dressed in leaves, blending into the forest. Fires were set to lure soldiers into traps. Mobility. Instead of standing battles, she favored quick raids and sudden retreats, exhausting the enemy. Psychological warfare, the Abeng horn. Sudden whistles and terrifying night raids made soldiers believe the jungle itself was against them. This strategy turned small groups of Maroons into an army that could match, and often, defeat the British Empire. The British. Desperation. By 1734, the British were in shock. They had spent fortunes sending troops into the mountains, but Nanny remained undefeated. One frustrated officer wrote, "This woman is worth more against us than an entire regiment. She must be destroyed." Rewards were posted for her capture, dead or alive, but no one could touch her. Every bounty hunter who entered the mountains either vanished or returned empty-handed, trembling with tales of ambushes and spirits. Nanny's people pay the price, but the war was not without cost. Each clash meant Maroon blood spilled as well. Children grew up knowing hunger and fear. Families mourned warriors who never returned. And still, Nanny carried the burden of leadership. She comforted the grieving, healed the wounded with herbs, and reminded her people, better to die in the mountains than to live in chains. Foreshadowing a turning point by the mid-1730s, the war reached a brutal stalemate. The British could not destroy Nanny, but the Maroons could not rest. Battles raged, villages burned, blood was spilled on both sides. And yet whispers began spreading in the colonial capital. Some said the British might finally send their most ruthless captains to finish the job. Others believed they might be forced to do the unthinkable, negotiate. But before peace would come, Nanny would face her greatest trial, one that would test the very heart of her leadership. The British came with fire and steel, marching in endless columns. They carried cannons, muskets, and dogs trained to hunt men. In their eyes, Nanny was no longer just a rebel leader. She was the beating heart of a nightmare that refused to die. To kill her was to kill the rebellion, but deep in the misty ridges of the Blue Mountains, the woman they feared most was already waiting. The biggest invasion yet. By 1734, the colonial government launched its most ambitious campaign. Hundreds of soldiers, including hardened veterans, were sent to crush Nanny once and for all. This time, they carried not only weapons but engineers and axemen to cut through the forest. Determined to carve a road into the Maroon strongholds, the redcoats climbed with banners flying, drummers pounding and cannons ready to thunder. They thought their sheer numbers would overwhelm any resistance, but they were wrong. The trap of the gorges. The soldiers pressed deeper into the mountains. Nanny prepared her greatest ambush. Her scouts guided her to a narrow gorge, a place where the path funneled into a choke point, hemmed in by cliffs. For days, her warriors dug pits, sharpened stakes, and positioned boulders high above the trail. The forest itself became a weapon. When the British marched into the gorge, the Abeng horn split the air. Boulders crashed down, smashing lines apart. Arrows whistled from the trees. Muskets cracked in the shadows. The enemy panicked, trapped, unable to spread into formation. Some tried to climb the cliffs, but Maroons rained spears on them. Others fled only to fall into hidden pits. Within hours, the gorge became a graveyard. This single battle sent shockwaves across Jamaica. Survivors whispered that Nanny herself had stood on the cliffs, arms raised, calling on spirits as the earth itself seemed to strike the invaders. The legend of the bullet catcher, it was during this bloody year that Nanny's most famous legend spread. Soldiers swore they had seen her catch bullets with her bare hands, or even with her body, and hurl them back. Some claimed she wore charms blessed with Obeah magic, others that ancestral spirits shielded her. Whether true or not, her enemies believed it, and fear gnawed at their morale. To them, fighting Nanny was not just war. It was battle against the supernatural, and that fear was her deadliest weapon. The price of resistance, but victory was never free. After the battle in the gorge, British forces retaliated with brutal raids. They torched fields, destroyed hidden farms, and slaughtered Maroon families wherever they could find them. Nanny Town itself was threatened once more. Smoke rose from the mountains as soldiers hacked their way closer, leaving ruin behind. Her people suffered hunger, exhaustion, and grief. Many had lost brothers, sisters, even children. Yet Nanny stood unshaken. At night she prayed at sacred groves, calling on her ancestors. At dawn she gathered her warriors, reminding them, "The mountain is our mother. She shelters us, she feeds us, and she will bury our enemies." The second siege determined to finish the job. The British launched another direct siege on Nanny Town. This time, they came prepared with heavier guns. Cannons roared through the forest, smashing huts and tearing down barricades. Nanny's people fought fiercely, but the enemy was relentless. For days, smoke filled the valley, the air thick with screams and thunder. The defenders were outnumbered, their food running low. At the climax, legend says Nanny herself stood before the charging soldiers, chanting prayers, her voice rising above the chaos. A musket ball struck her shoulder, but she did not fall. She raised her arms defiantly, and her warriors surged with renewed fury, driving the enemy back into retreat. Rumors of her death. After this brutal campaign, colonial reports claimed that Nanny had been killed. Some soldiers boasted they had seen her fall. Newspapers spread the news. The rebel woman Nanny is no more. But the mountains told another story. Survivors swore she still walked among her people, wounded but unbroken. Some said she had died and risen again through Obeah magic. Others believed she had simply melted into the forest untouchable. Whether dead or alive, the legend of Nanny only grew. To the enslaved, she was immortal. To the British, she was a phantom they could never silence. Nanny's last stand. By 1737, the war reached its cruel peak. Both sides were exhausted. The British had poured men and money into the fight, but freedom still held in the mountains. The Maroons had lost many lives, but their spirit was unbroken. In one of the final great clashes, British forces stormed toward Nanny Town once more. They found the village scarred but still alive. Women carried water to the wounded. Children huddled in caves, and warriors stood ready with bows, muskets, and machetes. The battle raged for days. The British forced their way inside, burning houses, killing defenders. Nanny, legend says, stood at the highest point, sounding the Abeng horn one last time as her people slipped into the forests. The town was destroyed, but the Maroons themselves lived on. The mountains swallowed them once again. The turning tide. Though the British claimed victory, the truth was bitter. They could not destroy the Maroons. Each time they burned a village, the people rebuilt deeper in the jungle. Each time they killed a leader, a new one rose. And if Nanny had truly died, her spirit lived on in every ambush, every horn, every cry of resistance. Colonial officers began to whisper what they had once sworn impossible, that the British Empire itself might have to kneel to a runaway slave woman. By 1738, the Blue Mountains were littered with ruins of battles, burnt huts, and unmarked graves. The British claimed they had destroyed Nanny Town, yet still the rebellion lived. Still the horns blew in the night. Still the plantations trembled as fires rose in the distance. And at the heart of it all, whether in flesh or in legend, stood the woman the British could never silence, Nanny of the Maroons. After the siege, the destruction of Nanny Town should have ended the war. That was the British expectation, but instead, it created a ghost that refused to die. Survivors melted into the forests, families scattered to hidden valleys, warriors regrouped in smaller bands, striking faster and vanishing quicker than ever. If anything, the destruction only hardened their resolve. British officers were forced to admit a chilling truth. They had not won. They had only created more shadows in the mountains. Whispers of Nanny, reports of Nanny's death circulated widely, but rumors of her survival spread just as quickly. Some said she lived among her people under a new name. Others believed her spirit guided the rebels even if her body was gone. For the enslaved on plantations, this rumor was hope. Nanny lives, they whispered. She watches from the mountains. She waits. To the British it was despair. Because every rumor, every whispered belief, meant that the rebellion could never truly be stamped out. The British wear down, year after year. The war drained the colonial government. Soldiers fell not only to ambushes but to fever, exhaustion, and fear. Supplies dwindled, costs soared, and plantation owners demanded protection. Meanwhile, the sugar economy, the lifeblood of Jamaica, began to falter. Slave uprisings increased as the Maroons inspired others. Fields went untended. Profits dropped, and the very system the British sought to protect started to collapse under its own weight. The British had to make a choice: fight until ruin, or try the unthinkable, negotiation. The turning point in 1738, emissaries were quietly sent into the mountains. White flags were raised and messages delivered. The British wished to talk. At first, the Maroons were suspicious. Every attempt at peace in the past had ended in betrayal. But the years of war had taken their toll. Families longed for security. Hunters wanted to live without constant fear. Children deserved to grow up outside the shadow of war, and so the Maroons agreed to meet. Nanny's council legend says that even if Nanny had fallen years earlier, her spirit still guided the Maroons. But many in the oral traditions of Jamaica insist she lived to see this moment, counseling her people on the terms of peace. She reminded them, "Never bow your head. If you meet with them, meet as equals. You have fought like warriors. They must see you as warriors." Her advice shaped the very heart of what came next: the great negotiations. The meeting took place in neutral territory, away from plantations and hidden valleys. British officers arrived in full uniform, expecting to intimidate. But when the Maroons entered, armed and unflinching, the balance shifted. No chains bound them. No fear bent their backs. These were not slaves. These were free people, hardened by years of war. Talks dragged for weeks. The British wanted total surrender. The Maroons demanded recognition of their freedom. Back and forth they argued, neither side willing to bow. At last, an agreement was struck. The Peace Treaty of 1739, the Maroons of Jamaica were officially recognized as free and autonomous people. They would keep their land in the mountains, live by their own laws, and remain outside the chains of slavery. In return, they were asked not to raid plantations, and, controversially, to return any future runaways who sought refuge with them. It was not a perfect treaty. Some saw it as betrayal. Others saw it as survival. But what mattered most was this: the British Empire, the most powerful force in the world, had bent its knee to people who had once been enslaved. And in that victory, the shadow of Nanny loomed large, the woman behind the peace. Even if she did not sign the treaty herself, historians debate whether she was alive then. Oral tradition is clear. Nanny's leadership made the treaty possible. Her courage, her vision, her defiance had forced the British to accept a truth they could never erase. The Maroons were unconquerable. Legacy sealed in blood and fire, the treaty marked the end of decades of war. For the British, it was a bitter pill. They had spent fortunes, spilled blood, and destroyed villages. Yet still they could not break the Maroons. For the Maroons, it was vindication. They had carved freedom out of the very mountains, turning chains into weapons, turning fear into fire. And at the heart of it all was the enslaved woman who rose to lead them, who turned the impossible into reality. Queen Nanny, a prophet, a general, A mother Nanny's story by this point had become more than history. She was remembered as a prophetess who spoke with ancestors, a general who outwitted empires, a mother who nurtured her people even as she led them through war. Every drumbeat, every horn, every whispered tale carried her spirit forward. The drums fell silent. The smoke of war cleared. For the first time in decades, the Blue Mountains of Jamaica did not echo with gunfire, but with laughter, song, and the sounds of children running free. The Treaty of 1739 had ended one of the fiercest wars in the Caribbean. But while peace brought safety, it also brought questions. What did freedom truly mean? And what became of the woman who had carried her people to the edge of the impossible? Queen Nanny. The world after the treaty, the British called it peace. But to the Maroons it was more than that. It was survival carved from fire and blood. At last, families could rebuild without fear of soldiers marching over the horizon. Hidden farms could become open fields again. Songs of mourning gave way to songs of planting and harvest. Children who had grown up knowing only war now played freely in the valleys. Old warriors laid down their muskets and returned to hunting. For the first time in living memory, the mountains were no longer a battlefield. They were home again, autonomy in the Blue Mountains. The treaty granted the Maroons land, freedom, and the right to self-rule. Villages grew stronger. Leaders built councils to govern, ensuring that British officers had no control within their borders. But there were rules, and not all were easy to bear. The treaty required the Maroons to stop harboring runaways. If an enslaved person fled the plantations and reached the mountains, the Maroons were expected to return them. This condition was bitter. Many warriors felt it was betrayal to their brothers and sisters still in chains. But others argued, without the treaty, all would be lost. The mountains would burn again, and the fragile freedom they had won could vanish overnight. Nanny herself, if alive then, is remembered in oral tradition as counseling her people to accept the treaty, but never forget their duty to freedom. A paper cannot chain the spirit, she is said to have declared. Help where you can. Protect where you must, but live, so that one day slavery will die. Nanny's fate, death or disappearance. Historians remain divided about Nanny's life after the treaty. Some records claim she died during the war, years earlier. Others suggest she lived into the 1740s or beyond, leading her people quietly in peace until old age took her. But among the Maroons, the truth is different. They say Nanny never died. She simply returned to the mountains, to the rivers, to the earth itself. When thunder rolled, they said it was her voice. When a sudden wind blew through the trees, it was her spirit passing. She had become something more than human, a guardian forever watching. The birth of a legend. In the years that followed, stories of Nanny grew. Mothers told their children how she could catch bullets in her hands. Warriors said her voice could summon armies of ancestors. Farmers believed she blessed their fields, ensuring the yams grew strong. British soldiers, too, carried her memory. Some whispered her name with respect, others with fear. To them, she was proof that the empire was not invincible. In this way, Nanny's legend spread beyond Jamaica. Among enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, her name became a spark. If Nanny could fight, so could they. If Nanny could win freedom, perhaps freedom was not impossible. Life in the free villages, the Maroon communities thrived. They became skilled farmers, traders, and hunters. They raised children who had never felt the crack of a whip or the weight of chains. Yet their lives remained tied to the world of slavery. British planters still ruled Jamaica. Thousands remained in bondage, their cries echoing across the fields. And every runaway who appeared at a Maroon gate reminded them of the uneasy compromise they had made. This tension lingered for generations. But in every moral debate, Nanny's name arose. What would Nanny do? Became a question of conscience, and the answer was rarely simple. Nanny as symbol of unity over time. Nanny became more than a historical figure. She became the symbol of Maroon identity. Her courage was not just remembered, it was lived. Every festival honored her. Every council meeting invoked her spirit. She was the mother of the Maroons, the guiding ancestor. Even when generations passed, children grew up hearing that their freedom was not granted by the British crown, but won by Nanny's fire. The British perspective in the colonial archives. Nanny was reduced to a footnote, a rebel woman, a witch, a troublemaker. They sought to erase her greatness, because to admit it was to admit that an enslaved African woman had forced the empire to its knees. But no record, no ink on parchment could silence the drums of memory. Her name lived louder in song than in any book. The immortality of a rebel by the late 18th century, Nanny was spoken of as a spirit more than a woman. She became part of the Maroon cosmology, a warrior ancestor who guided dreams and visions. Runaway slaves whispered her name as a prayer. Abolitionists in Europe cited her as proof that the enslaved would never accept chains quietly. And in Jamaica itself, she became both a shadow and a torch, unseen but always burning. Even after the treaty was signed, even after the guns fell silent, the British could not rest. They had crushed villages, burned crops, spilled blood in the mountains. And yet every time the wind howled through the valleys of Jamaica, they swore they heard her name, Nanny. She was gone, perhaps, but her shadow still walked the earth, the unfinished war. The peace of 1739 created a fragile calm. Plantations were safe again, profits resumed, and the island's rulers boasted that the rebellion problem was over. But deep down, every colonial officer knew the truth. The Maroons had not been defeated. They had been recognized. Worse still, they had been led to victory by a woman, an enslaved woman who had turned into a general, a prophet, and a ghost. And so, while the treaties ended open warfare, they could not kill the fear. The British still built forts at plantation edges, militia patrols still trained, and whenever whispers of rebellion stirred among the enslaved, authorities muttered the same name, another Nanny. The whisper among the enslaved for those still trapped in bondage, Nanny's story spread like fire. Her name became a secret password of courage. Around plantation fires at night, slaves would tell her story, how she caught bullets with her bare hands, how she summoned spirits to blind the redcoats, how she led her people to freedom in the mountains. Each telling made her greater than before. Each detail blurred the line between history and legend. For the enslaved, it did not matter if she was flesh or spirit. What mattered was that she proved freedom was possible. Nanny lives, they whispered. And in that whisper lay defiance. The British nightmare to the colonial masters, Nanny became a symbol of dread. Whenever a runaway escaped, they feared she had reached the Maroons. Whenever a plantation caught fire, they feared her spirit had returned. Reports from the 1740s and 1750s tell of British soldiers refusing to march into certain valleys, convinced that Nanny's Obeah magic still guarded them. Officers complained that discipline faltered because men feared shadows more than bullets. The war was over, but Nanny's psychological grip on the colony remained unbroken. The Second Maroon War looms decades later in the 1790s. Tensions between Maroons and the British flared again in what became known as the Second Maroon War. Though Nanny herself was long gone, her legend hovered over the conflict. Both sides invoked her memory. The Maroons fought with the same guerrilla tactics she had taught. The British, haunted by the past, dreaded that her ghost would inspire another unstoppable rebellion. Even in absence, Nanny dictated the strategies of the living, the double-edged legacy. But Nanny's memory was not only inspiration, it was also controversy. Because of the treaty clause requiring Maroons to return runaway slaves, some accused the Maroons of betraying the very cause Nanny had lived for. How could her children hunt the very people she had once sheltered? Oral traditions suggest that many Maroons struggled with this burden. Some secretly helped runaways escape to other parts of the island. Others justified the compromise as survival. And through every argument, her name was invoked. Was this what Nanny would have wanted? Was the treaty a necessary shield, or a betrayal of her fire? Songs, drums, and memory among the Maroons themselves. Nanny was never just debated. She was celebrated. Drums told her story in rhythms passed down generations. Songs praised her as Mama Nanny, the eternal mother of freedom. Festivals in her honor kept alive not just her memory, but the identity of the Maroons as unconquerable people. Even when children could not read the colonial histories, they knew Nanny's story by heart. It lived in every chant, every dance, every horn blast echoing in the valleys. Across the Caribbean, Nanny's story did not remain in Jamaica alone. News of her defiance reached enslaved Africans across the Caribbean. In Haiti, whispers of a Jamaican warrior woman blended with local tales of voodoo priestesses who would soon ignite their own revolution. In Suriname, rebels in the jungles carried similar legends of women who fought alongside men. And in every colony, the British feared that another, Nanny, might rise from the cane fields. Her name had become transnational, a myth of resistance, carried wherever slavery tried to chain the human spirit, the woman versus the legend. Historians, centuries later, would still ask, who was the real Nanny? Was she a flesh-and-blood general who signed treaties, or a myth shaped by song and memory? The truth may never be clear, but perhaps that is the point. Nanny was not only a woman, she was a mirror for the hopes of the enslaved and the fears of the oppressor. As long as her name lived, she remained undefeated. Closing scene. In the mountains of Jamaica. On a quiet night, a horn still echoes sometimes. Farmers say it is only the wind. Children say it is the abeng horn of the Maroons calling warriors to gather. But the old ones smile knowingly. They say it is Nanny herself walking through the forest reminding her people, freedom is never given, freedom is taken. Centuries after the guns fell silent in the Blue Mountains, her name still thundered across Jamaica. She had been called a witch, a general, a prophet, a ghost, but in the 20th century, the island gave her a new name, national hero. From rebel fugitive to eternal mother, Nanny's story had crossed time itself. The passing of centuries, after the Treaty of 1739, Jamaica changed. Plantations grew larger, slavery expanded, and the island became one of Britain's richest colonies. The Maroons, meanwhile, lived in guarded independence, navigating the uneasy balance between survival and loyalty to their ancestors. But while the world moved forward, Nanny's legend never faded. Her name was carried in songs, whispered in prayers, and etched in the oral histories of the Maroons. Even when enslaved Africans on plantations had no books, no schools, they still had stories. And among those stories, none burned brighter than Nanny's. The age of abolition. By the early 19th century, the winds of change began to stir. Slave revolts rocked the Caribbean, Tacky's rebellion in Jamaica, the Baptist War, and the Great Haitian Revolution that shook the world. In all of these movements, Nanny's spirit was present. Rebels chanted her name, invoking her as proof that freedom could be won. The British, too, remembered her. Their fear of another Nanny fueled their paranoia whenever uprisings spread. When slavery was finally abolished in Jamaica in 1834, the Maroons celebrated, not as beneficiaries of British mercy, but as proof that Nanny's war had never been in vain. Colonial forgetting versus Maroon memory. The British tried to write her out of official history. Colonial records mentioned her only briefly, often dismissing her as a rebel woman or accusing her of witchcraft. But among the Maroons, her memory lived like fire. Every drumbeat at a festival, every abeng horn blast in the mountains, every whispered tale to children, all kept her alive. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Jamaica began to push for independence, Nanny's name returned with force. Scholars, activists, and freedom fighters rediscovered her story, lifting her from folklore into the heart of the national identity. Independence and rediscovery. In 1962, Jamaica won its independence from Britain. The young nation needed symbols, figures of strength, resilience, and unity that could inspire future generations. Nanny rose naturally to that place. She was not just a Maroon leader, but the embodiment of resistance itself. A woman who had dared to fight an empire and had won. Songs, poems, and plays resurrected her story. Artists painted her as warrior and mother. Schools taught her name with reverence. Where the British had tried to erase, Jamaicans now wrote her into the soul of their nation. National hero of Jamaica. In 1975, the Jamaican government formally declared Nanny of the Maroons a national hero. This was no small honor. Only 7 figures in Jamaican history held this title. Leaders, freedom fighters, and visionaries. And Nanny stood among them, not only as the sole woman, but as a reminder that Jamaica's foundation was written in resistance. Her image soon appeared on murals, textbooks, and cultural celebrations. She became a central part of Jamaica's official history, not just Maroon memory. The $500 note in 1994. Nanny's face was immortalized on Jamaica's $500 banknote. For generations of Jamaicans, this was more than currency. It was daily recognition of a woman who had once lived in hiding, hunted in the mountains, her worth measured only in bounties. Now her image symbolized wealth, pride, and national honor. Children who once only knew her from stories now saw her face every day, a reminder that their history was not one of defeat, but of triumph. Nanny as feminist icon in the modern world. Nanny has also become a symbol of women's strength. She was not just a fighter. She was a leader, a mother, a spiritual guide. For Jamaican women, she represents resilience in the face of oppression. For Black feminists worldwide, she is a reminder that women were not just passive victims of slavery, but active warriors, shaping history with blood and fire. Global legacy, Nanny's story has traveled beyond Jamaica, across the African diaspora, in the United States, Brazil, Suriname, and beyond. She is remembered as part of a larger tradition of slave resistance. She stands alongside figures like Zumbi dos Palmares in Brazil and Harriet Tubman in America, rebels who proved that enslaved people were not silent, but fierce, determined, and visionary, the spirit in the mountains even today. In Jamaica's Blue Mountains, the Maroons still tell stories of Nanny. They say she walks the forests at night, her spirit guarding the land. The abbing horn is still blown in ceremonies, and her name is still invoked in prayer. For the Maroons, Nanny is not past. She is present. She is the earth beneath their feet, the wind in the trees, the voice in the drums. Closing scene. A child in modern Jamaica holds a $500 bill, staring at Nanny's face. Outside, the mountains rise in the distance, the same mountains where she once fought. The child's grandmother leans down and whispers, "Never forget. This is your mother, the woman who gave you freedom." And in that moment, across centuries, Nanny breathes again. Centuries may pass, empires may fall, but some names refuse to die. In Jamaica and beyond, Nanny of the Maroons is no longer just a memory. She is a living presence. A warrior who became a spirit who became a symbol, and a symbol who still shapes identity in the 21st century. Festivals of fire and drumming, Jamaica's Maroon villages, Accompong, Moortown, Charlestown. Every year, festivals are held in Nanny's honor. The air fills with the beat of drums, the cry of the abang horn, and the aroma of traditional foods. Elders retell her story to young ones. Dancers move like warriors in the night, and songs rise to call her name. For the Maroons, these are not just cultural shows. They are rituals of survival, ways of keeping the bond between ancestors and descendants alive. Every drumbeat is a heartbeat from Nanny's time. Every dance step is a reminder that freedom was not given, but fought for. Academia rediscovers Nanny. Across the world, scholars write books, theses, and essays about Nanny. She is studied as a military strategist, one of the most brilliant guerrilla tacticians of the 18th century. A spiritual leader, master of Obeah, guiding her people not just with weapons but with faith. A feminist icon, a woman who broke every boundary of her age, a symbol of Pan-African resistance, connecting struggles in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Universities in Jamaica, the U.S., and Africa hold conferences discussing her influence. For historians, Nanny is both fact and legend, a figure who blurs the line between recorded history and oral tradition. The battle over memory. Nanny's story is not without debate. Some historians argue the British exaggerated her powers to spread fear. Others claim her Obeah magic was symbolic, not literal. Did she really catch bullets? Did she truly vanish like smoke in the forest? For the Maroons, such questions miss the point. Whether myth or fact, her legend is truth of the spirit. She was powerful because people believed in her. She was victorious because faith turned to action. The diaspora's Nanny in London, Toronto, New York. Wherever Jamaicans and Afro-Caribbeans live, Nanny's story is told again. Murals paint her face on city walls. Cultural groups name themselves after her. And spoken word artists call her name in their performances. For the Black diaspora, she is more than Jamaican history. She is shared history. A reminder that across oceans, enslaved people resisted, fought, and built legacies of freedom. In African American circles, she is placed alongside Harriet Tubman. In Brazil, her story resonates with the legend of Zumbi dos Palmares. In Ghana, she is remembered as a daughter of Africa who carried her homeland into the New World. Modern politics and resistance Nanny's image has also been invoked in politics. Activists fighting for racial justice, women's rights, and indigenous autonomy often use her as a symbol. Protest banners carry her face. Her name is shouted in marches. She represents the eternal fight against oppression, proof that the powerless can stand against the powerful and win. Art, music, and literature musicians have sung of her. Reggae and dancehall artists invoke her as a warrior mother. Poets have written verses praising her courage. Painters depict her with flames in her eyes, bow in hand, standing unyielding against the empire. In novels, plays, and films, she reappears again and again, sometimes as a ghost, sometimes as a heroine, sometimes as both. One playwright once described her as the woman who turned the mountains into her sword and the forest into her shield. Tourism and sacred ground, the site once known as Nanny Town, has become a national heritage site in Jamaica. Visitors hike into the Blue Mountains to see the ruins, waterfalls, and caves where her warriors once hid. For many, the journey is pilgrimage, not tourism. Standing where she once stood, hearing the mountain winds, one feels that Nanny is still there watching. Guides tell her story with reverence. Some even claim you can hear her voice in the rushing water, whispering freedom. Children of Nanny, but perhaps her greatest legacy is in children. In Jamaican schools, her story is taught not as legend, but as foundation. Every child learns that before independence, before abolition, there was Nanny. That freedom was born not in the pens of lawmakers, but in the hands of rebels who would not kneel. Girls look at her as proof that leadership is not bound by gender. Boys look at her as proof that courage is not bound by size. All look at her as the mother of a nation. Closing scene. The festival fires burn in Moortown, the drums thunder. An abeng horn splits the night. A young girl dressed in white dances with her eyes closed. She is not just dancing, she is remembering. Behind her, elders nod, knowing that Nanny lives in this moment. Somewhere in the mountain wind, a whisper rises. Freedom is not given. Freedom is taken. And so long as those words are remembered, Nanny will never die. History often forgets women. Their names vanish in dusty records, their deeds buried beneath men's wars and kings' crowns. But Nanny of the Maroons could not be erased. She refused silence. She refused invisibility. From the mountains of Jamaica, her voice rose like thunder. And centuries later, it still echoes. The flesh and the flame at her core, Nanny was a woman of flesh and blood. She laughed, she wept, she struggled. She buried comrades, comforted children, and stared into the darkness of empire. But what makes her immortal is that she was also more than flesh. She was flame. Every story of her obeah, every tale of her catching bullets or vanishing in smoke was proof of how her people saw her. She was not just their leader. She was their shield, their mother, their miracle. Myth and history, as one scholars may argue, where the line between truth and legend lies. Was she born in Ghana? Did she truly die in the 1730s? Or live decades longer in the shadows? Did she command armies with strategy or with spirit? But for the people who carried her name, such questions are irrelevant. Nanny is history. Nanny is myth. And both are true, because what is history if not the stories we choose to remember? What is myth if not the truths too powerful for paper to hold? The eternal mother for Jamaicans, Nanny became more than a leader. She became a mother, not of bloodline but of destiny. She mothered a people by giving them survival. She mothered a nation by carving a path to freedom. When her children were enslaved, she fought. When her children were hunted, she protected. When her children despaired, she gave them hope. Even today, Jamaicans call her Mother Nanny. And in that name lies something deeper than politics or history. It is reverence. It is gratitude. It is love. The symbol of resistance across the globe. Oppressed peoples look to Nanny as proof of what is possible. She is not frozen in the 18th century. She walks with every rebel, every activist, every dreamer who dares to rise against injustice. To women, she is proof that leadership knows no gender. To the Black diaspora, she is proof that slavery never fully broke its victims. To freedom movements everywhere, she is proof that empires can bleed. Her story whispers to anyone who stands before a giant and feels small. You are not powerless. You are Nanny's child. The land keeps her in Jamaica's blue mountains. The earth still remembers her footsteps. Nanny Town's ruins sit quiet among rivers and forests, but the silence is alive. Travelers claim to feel her presence in the waterfalls, to hear her voice in the wind. For the Maroons, this is not imagination. This is truth. The land that sheltered her still carries her spirit. And as long as the mountains stand, Nanny will never vanish. Legacy written in stone and song, her name is carved into monuments, written into textbooks, printed on money. Her face gazes from the $500 note, not as a queen in gold, but as a warrior wrapped in spirit. Children sing songs of her in schools. Drums beat her memory at festivals. Artists paint her fire. Poets call her name. Every generation shapes her anew. Yet every generation keeps her the same, untamed, unbroken, eternal. From Jamaica to the world, Nanny's story is no longer bound to one island. She is taught in classrooms across the Caribbean, studied in universities in the US and Africa, honored in plays and films worldwide. In Harlem, her name is spoken alongside Malcolm X and Harriet Tubman. In Brazil, she is remembered as kin to Zumbi dos Palmares. In Ghana, she is recognized as a daughter returned through memory. Nanny's fight was not just Jamaica's. It was the fight of all enslaved people, all colonized people, all who longed for dignity. Closing reflection, the flame that never dies. History tells us that Nanny lived in the 18th century, but history also tells us she lives still, not in body, but in spirit, in symbol, in song. She is the whisper in the abeng horn, the shadow in the forest, the face in the firelight. She is the mother who catches bullets with her hand, who vanishes into smoke, who leads armies from beyond the grave. She is Nanny, woman, warrior, spirit, nation. Final scene. The camera rises above Jamaica's blue mountains at dawn. Mist curls like smoke, rivers glimmer silver, and the drums of a Maroon festival echo faintly. In the distance, a voice, soft yet unyielding, whispers, "Remember me not as a ghost of the past, but as the fire in your future." The sun rises, golden and fierce, and the mountains blaze like flame. Epilogue. Because her story isn't ending, Nanny of the Maroons is more than history's rebel. She is proof that resistance can outlive oppression. Proof that one woman can become a nation. Proof that legends never die, and so, whenever injustice rises, whenever freedom is threatened, one can be certain of this: somewhere, in the heartbeat of a drum, in the cry of the wind, in the courage of the oppressed, Nanny still fights.